The transport truck lurched to a stop outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Klaus Werner felt his stomach drop for reasons that had nothing to do with the jarring brakes. Through the canvas flap he could see a wooden sign painted in crisp white letters, the name blazing in afternoon sunlight like an accusation, like a joke, like something his mind refused to process. Lancaster. Not an American approximation or coincidental similarity, but Lancaster spelled exactly as it would be in the Palatinate region where his grandmother had baked bread in a stone oven older than America itself. For 3 weeks since his capture near the Ruhr pocket, Klaus had prepared himself for execution, for brutal interrogation, for the savage treatment that Reich propaganda had promised awaited all German soldiers who fell into enemy hands. He had not prepared himself for this. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Klaus Werner had spent 26 months fighting across France and Belgium, watching his regiment dissolve from 3,000 men to barely 200 as American artillery methodically destroyed everything the Wehrmacht had built. He had survived the Hürtgen Forest, where trees exploded into splinters that killed men more efficiently than bullets. He had endured the final desperate winter when German soldiers ate tree bark and boiled leather boots for sustenance while American forces advanced with rations that included chocolate bars and cigarettes. Through it all, the propaganda had sustained him with promises that made sense of the suffering. America was a mongrel nation without culture or history, a commercial enterprise masquerading as a country, populated by inferior races who would collapse under the discipline of true Germanic warfare. German cities bore names that stretched back 1,000 years to Charlemagne and beyond, while American settlements were crude outposts barely a century old, named after forgotten explorers or meaningless Indian words. Klaus had believed these things completely because they fit the evidence he could observe. American soldiers carried so much equipment they seemed like pack animals waddling under loads no proper German soldier would tolerate. They wasted ammunition with reckless abandon, firing thousands of rounds where Germans made every bullet count. They relied on material superiority rather than tactical excellence, on quantity rather than quality, on industrial production rather than warrior spirit. Yet here he sat, shackled in a truck outside a town called Lancaster, and something fundamental was breaking apart in his understanding of the world. The guard who opened the canvas flap was a young private named Thompson, probably 19 years old, with the soft hands of someone who had never known real hunger. He gestured for the prisoners to dismount with casual authority that suggested he had performed this task dozens of times. His rifle hung loose on its sling, pointed at nothing in particular, because he clearly did not expect resistance from men who had surrendered their weapons along with their illusions of German invincibility. 12 German prisoners climbed down from the truck bed, blinking in September sunlight that felt wrong somehow, too bright and clean for men who had lived in muddy foxholes for 2 years. Klaus was the oldest at 31, a former schoolteacher from Württemberg who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1943 when the conscription age expanded to include men previously considered too educated for frontline service. The youngest was Friedrich Bauer, barely 18, who had been drafted directly from the Hitler Youth and sent to the front with 3 weeks of training. They stood in a cluster on packed earth, surrounded by buildings that could have been transplanted directly from the Rhineland. Neat brick construction with steep pitched roofs, shuttered windows painted in blues and greens, storefronts displaying goods behind glass that caught the afternoon light. But the abundance visible through those windows made Klaus's throat tighten with emotions he could not name. A bakery across the street displayed loaves of white bread stacked in pyramids, their crusts golden brown and perfect. Real white bread made with wheat flour that had not existed in Germany since before the war began. Klaus had not seen bread like that since 1940, and even then only at party functions reserved for regional officials. Next to the bakery stood a general store with windows full of goods that seemed to mock everything he had endured. Canned vegetables and bright labels, sacks of sugar and flour visible through the doorway, glass jars filled with preserves that glowed like amber in the sunlight. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and crushing. This was supposed to be a nation strained to breaking by total war, struggling to maintain production while fighting on multiple continents. Yet here in a random Pennsylvania town, civilian shops displayed abundance that exceeded anything Klaus had witnessed in peacetime Germany. Guard Thompson led them down the main street toward what appeared to be a converted school building that would serve as their processing center. As they walked, Klaus noticed details that accumulated like evidence in a trial where he stood accused of catastrophic stupidity. The streets were paved with smooth asphalt, not the cobblestones common in German towns. Telephone wires stretched between wooden poles connecting every building to a communications network that functioned despite years of global warfare. Automobiles lined the curbs, civilian vehicles that consumed gasoline while American forces simultaneously fueled the largest mechanized military in history. But the names kept striking him like physical blows. They passed Strasbourg Street, then a sign pointing toward Hamburg. Not crude American approximations, but exact replicas of German place names, spelled with the same careful attention to detail that characterized everything else about this impossible town. Friedrich Bauer walked beside Klaus, his young face slack with confusion that mirrored Klaus's internal state. The boy had been indoctrinated more thoroughly than older soldiers, raised entirely within the Nazi education system, taught from age 6 that Germany represented civilization's pinnacle, while America embodied mongrel degeneracy. Seeing a Pennsylvania town that looked more prosperous than any German city Friedrich had ever visited was destroying foundations laid over 12 years of careful propaganda. Inside the processing center they encountered organization that functioned with mechanical precision despite handling thousands of prisoners flowing through the American occupation system. Forms printed in both English and German waiting in neat stacks, typewriters clacking as clerks recorded information with efficiency that suggested endless supplies of paper, ribbon, and carbon sheets. Electric lights overhead providing illumination so steady and bright it seemed artificial after years of candlelight and darkness. Klaus provided his information to a clerk who spoke German with a Pennsylvania Dutch accent that sounded simultaneously familiar and alien. The man asked questions from a standardized form, typing responses on a machine that was newer and better maintained than any equipment Klaus had seen in Wehrmacht headquarters. When Klaus mentioned he had been a school teacher before conscription, the clerk noted this with apparent interest, explaining that educated prisoners would receive different work assignments than those with only manual labor skills. The casual assumption that prisoners would be assigned productive work rather than executed or tortured represented another crack in the propaganda framework. Klaus had expected brutality, had steeled himself for treatment that matched what he knew happened in German camps. Instead, he encountered bureaucratic efficiency focused on categorization and appropriate assignment. After processing, the 12 prisoners were led to barracks that had been prepared with amenities that challenged everything Klaus thought he understood about wartime resource allocation. Bunk beds with actual mattresses, not straw pallets or bare boards. Wool blankets that were clean and whole without the lice infestations that plagued German military supplies. A bathroom with running water, both hot and cold, flowing from taps that worked with simple mechanical reliability. Friedrich stood in the bathroom doorway staring at porcelain fixtures with the expression of someone witnessing a miracle. The boy turned the hot water tap and jumped back when steam rose from water heated somewhere in the building's infrastructure, delivered on demand without fire or manual labor. In 3 years of military service, Friedrich had never experienced hot water that did not require carrying buckets and heating them over scarce fuel. That evening they received their first meal as prisoners of war, and Klaus felt his worldview shatter like glass striking concrete. The food arrived on metal trays divided into sections, each portion containing more nutrition than German soldiers had seen in months. Roasted chicken with skin that had been crisped in ovens fueled by abundant coal or gas. Mashed potatoes made with real butter and milk, not the turnip substitutes that had become standard in Germany. Green beans that had been canned at peak freshness, then cooked until tender. White bread with a pat of butter. A small square of chocolate for dessert. Klaus stared at his tray, unable to process what he was seeing. This was prisoner food, the minimum standard for enemy combatants held under Geneva Convention protocols. Yet it exceeded anything he had eaten since before the war, surpassed the rations provided to German officers, made mockery of the turnip soup and sawdust bread that had sustained Wehrmacht forces during the final year of fighting. The other prisoners ate in silence, their faces reflecting similar psychological demolition. Hans Müller, a former mechanic from Hamburg, began crying quietly while chewing chicken that was tender and rich with fat. Ernst Vogel, who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, sat frozen with a forkful of mashed potatoes halfway to his mouth, apparently unable to reconcile the creamy texture and butter flavor with his expectations of American cruelty. After dinner, Klaus lay on his bunk and listened to whispered conversations that revealed how thoroughly the day had destabilized his fellow prisoners. Friedrich was trying to make sense of the town names, proposing theories that became increasingly desperate as each one collapsed under basic logic. Perhaps the Americans had renamed towns to mock German prisoners, Friedrich suggested, but that made no sense when the names predated the war by centuries, when local residents spoke with German-inflected accents suggesting generations of settlement. Maybe these were recent German immigrants who had built replicas of homeland towns, Ernst proposed. But the architecture was too old, the infrastructure too established, the integration too complete for recent construction. The truth was more devastating than any theory they could construct, though none of them wanted to acknowledge it yet. These towns existed because Germans had been coming to America for 300 years, building communities that prospered in ways the fatherland never had, creating abundance through freedom rather than through conquest. Klaus understood this intellectually, but accepting it emotionally meant confronting implications too massive to process in a single evening. He had fought for a regime that promised to make Germany great, not realizing that Germans who had left the fatherland centuries earlier had already achieved greatness by abandoning the very nationalism that now defined the Third Reich. The following morning brought work assignments that further challenged Klaus's understanding of American society and its relationship to captured enemies. The 12 prisoners were divided into groups based on the skills they had listed during processing. Klaus and 3 others who had listed education or professional backgrounds were assigned to a local farm that needed help with harvest operations. The remaining 8 who had listed manual labor experience went to different agricultural sites around Lancaster County.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The farmer who collected Klaus's group was named Jacob Zimmerman, and he spoke German with the same Pennsylvania Dutch accent Klaus had noticed in the processing clerk. Zimmerman drove a truck that was newer and better maintained than any vehicle Klaus had seen in Wehrmacht motor pools, consuming gasoline with casual abundance while explaining that he owned 400 acres of farmland that he worked with 2 hired hands in seasonal labor. 400 acres. Klaus tried to process the scale. His grandfather had owned 12 acres in Württemberg, considered a substantial holding in a region where land was precious and divided among generations. Yet this Pennsylvania farmer casually mentioned owning more than 30 times that amount, discussing it as a medium-sized operation rather than an exceptional estate. As they drove through countryside that looked like Bavaria transplanted to America, Klaus noticed details that accumulated into devastating evidence. Barns larger than anything he had seen in Germany, built with lumber so abundant that walls were double-planked for insulation. Silos filled with grain that would feed German villages for months. Tractors parked beside equipment sheds, multiple machines representing capital investment that exceeded what most German communities could raise collectively. Zimmerman explained the work with casual authority. They would be harvesting corn, loading it onto trucks, and transporting it to storage facilities where it would be processed into feed for livestock. The pay would be 50 cents per day, provided in scrip that could be used at the prison camp commissary to purchase cigarettes, candy, and other comfort items. The work would be hard but not dangerous, 8 hours daily with a break for lunch that Zimmerman's wife would provide. The casual mention of payment stunned Klaus. German prisoners received wages for their labor. The concept contradicted everything he understood about prisoner treatment, where captives existed as resources to be exploited until death or release. Yet here was a Pennsylvania farmer explaining compensation structures as if German prisoners were temporary employees rather than defeated enemies. They arrived at Zimmerman's farm to find operations that functioned with efficiency that embarrassed Klaus's memories of German agricultural methods. A mechanical corn picker moved through fields, stripping ears from stalks with mechanical precision that eliminated the need for manual harvesting. Trucks waited at field edges to receive loads that would have required days of hand labor to collect. Storage facilities rose like cathedrals, their capacity exceeding anything Klaus had imagined possible for a single-family farm. But what destroyed Klaus completely was not the abundance or the machinery or the scale. It was the name painted on the barn in letters 3 feet tall. Zimmerman Family Farm, established 1742. 177 years before Klaus was born, Germans had been farming this Pennsylvania soil, building prosperity that accumulated across generations, creating abundance through peaceful settlement rather than military conquest. Klaus's group was assigned to load corn onto trucks, work that was physically demanding but supported by infrastructure that minimized unnecessary effort. Conveyor belts moved grain from pickers to trucks, hydraulic lifts raised loads that would have required multiple men with ropes and pulleys. Water stations provided clean drinking water throughout the day, dispensed from taps connected to wells that never seemed to run dry. They worked alongside Zimmerman's 2 hired hands, both young men who had been classified as essential agricultural workers and thus exempted from military service. One was named Peter, the other Thomas, and they treated the German prisoners with casual friendliness that suggested they had worked with previous groups and found them competent enough to warrant basic courtesy. Peter explained the mechanical corn picker's operation while they waited for another load, describing technical specifications with the ease of someone who had grown up around machinery. The picker could harvest 10 acres daily, he mentioned, compared to the 2 acres that a skilled worker might hand harvest in the same time. It ran on gasoline produced in refineries that operated continuously throughout the war, consuming petroleum that American forces simultaneously used to fuel tanks, planes and ships across multiple theaters of operation. The implications crashed over Klaus like a physical weight. America possessed such overwhelming industrial capacity that it could mechanize agriculture while fighting global war, could provide farm equipment to civilians while producing military vehicles in quantities that overwhelmed German resistance. The mechanical picker represented surplus production from an economy so vast that efficiency improvements in farming did not compete with military needs. At midday, Zimmermann's wife arrived with lunch that continued the pattern of impossible abundance. Sandwiches made with white bread, thick slices of ham, cheese that had not been rationed into gray scarcity, fresh tomatoes from gardens that produced vegetables for pleasure rather than survival. There were apples from orchards that had been planted generations earlier, cookies made with real sugar and butter, and thermoses of coffee that was actual Brazilian beans rather than acorn substitutes. Klaus bit into his sandwich and tasted peace. Not the peace of ceasefire or armistice, but the peace of a society that had never known the total mobilization that had consumed Germany. This food represented surplus production, comfort eating, a civilization so secure that farmers' wives made cookies for prisoners because hospitality was habit rather than strategy. Friedrich sat beside Klaus on a wooden fence rail, eating his sandwich with mechanical motions that suggested his mind was elsewhere. The boy had been raised to believe that Germans were inherently superior to mongrel American populations, that racial purity ensured cultural and economic dominance, that the Third Reich represented civilization's culmination. Yet here he sat eating food provided by German Americans who had prospered precisely because they had left behind the nationalism that now defined the fatherland. After lunch they resumed work under afternoon sun that felt cleaner and brighter than European skies. Klaus remembered. The harvest continued with mechanical efficiency, corn flowing from fields to trucks to storage facilities and streams of golden abundance that would feed livestock through winter months. Each ear represented surplus production from a food system so robust that American agriculture fed its own population, supplied military forces on multiple continents, and still generated exports to allies who could no longer feed themselves. As the afternoon progressed, Zimmermann engaged Klaus in conversation that revealed the depth of German self-deception. The farmer mentioned casually that Lancaster County produced more agricultural output than several German provinces combined despite having fewer workers. He described this as natural result of mechanization, abundant land and free market incentives that rewarded efficiency. Klaus asked about the German names, unable to restrain his curiosity any longer. Zimmermann smiled with the patience of someone who had explained this many times to other German prisoners. His ancestors had left the Palatinate in 1741, fleeing religious persecution and economic hardship that had plagued German states for generations. They had settled in Pennsylvania, attracted by promises of religious freedom, abundant land and a government that did not conscript sons for endless dynastic wars. The Zimmermann family had prospered across 2 centuries, each generation building on the previous generation's foundation. They had bought land, constructed barns, planted orchards and established themselves as substantial farmers while their cousins who remained in Germany struggled through Napoleonic wars, revolutions, failed harvests, and finally the catastrophic militarism that had destroyed the Second Reich and now the Third. Zimmermann mentioned these things without pride or condemnation, simply explaining historical facts, but Klaus heard the unspoken comparison. Germans who had left the fatherland had achieved everything the Third Reich promised through conquest, but they had done it peacefully through 3 centuries of farming, trading and building communities that valued productivity over military glory. The workday ended at 5 o'clock, marked by a bell that rang from Zimmermann's barn with the regularity of a civilization that measured time in mechanical precision rather than approximate daylight. They loaded onto the truck for transport back to the processing center, their bodies tired from honest labor but not the bone-deep exhaustion Klaus remembered from military service. 8 hours of productive work with adequate breaks, proper tools and sufficient food produced fatigue rather than the collapse that came from pushing bodies beyond human limits. As they drove back through Lancaster's streets, Klaus noticed details he had missed during the initial shock of arrival: a church with a bulletin board advertising services in both English and German, a school where children played in a yard surrounded by fence that existed to mark property rather than contain prisoners, homes with gardens that grew flowers for beauty rather than vegetables for survival, a luxury that indicated resources beyond mere subsistence. The names continued their devastating testimony. They passed through Mannheim, then signs pointing toward Heidelberg and Strasbourg, not occasional coincidences but systematic naming that reflected settlement patterns stretching back 300 years. Germans had been building these towns since before the United States existed as a nation, creating communities that preserved language and culture while embracing the freedom that made prosperity possible. That evening, Klaus lay in his bunk and tried to process the day's implications. He had worked for wages on a farm that produced more food than entire German districts. He had been fed meals that exceeded officer rations. He had witnessed infrastructure and organization that functioned despite years of total war that should have strained every system to collapse. Most devastating was the realization that Germans could succeed, had succeeded when freed from the nationalism that now defined the Third Reich. The evidence was irrefutable. Lancaster County, populated largely by German immigrants and their descendants, had achieved prosperity that exceeded anything the fatherland had accomplished. They had done it without racial purity laws, without military conquest, without the 1,000-year Reich's promises of greatness through force. Friedrich was crying quietly in the bunk above Klaus, though the boy tried to muffle the sounds. Klaus understood completely. They had both believed in something that required them to ignore 3 centuries of evidence that contradicted Nazi ideology. German Americans had proven that German culture could thrive without fascism, that German work ethic could produce abundance without conquest, that German people could achieve everything the Third Reich promised through the very democratic capitalism that Nazi propaganda had condemned as weakness. The following days established a routine that reinforced these devastating truths. Each morning they returned to Zimmermann's farm and worked 8 hours harvesting corn that would feed livestock that would produce meat, milk and eggs in quantities that staggered Klaus's understanding of agricultural production. Each afternoon they witnessed mechanical efficiency and organizational competence that made German farming methods appear medieval by comparison. Each evening they returned to barracks where they received meals that exceeded anything they had known in military service. But the psychological impact went beyond material abundance. It was the casual nature of everything that destroyed propaganda's foundations. These Pennsylvania farmers did not celebrate their superiority or mock German poverty. They simply lived as they always had, working productive farms, maintaining profitable businesses, building communities that functioned with the smooth efficiency of people who had never doubted that tomorrow would be better than yesterday. Zimmermann mentioned during one lunch break that his son was serving with the Third Army, currently advancing through Bavaria toward Austria. He spoke of this without particular emotion, noting that the boy wrote letters describing German cities he recognized from family stories. The cognitive dissonance was perfect. A Pennsylvania German fighting to destroy the fatherland his ancestors had left centuries earlier, defending an American democracy that had allowed his family to prosper in ways the Reich had only promised. Klaus asked why Zimmermann's ancestors had left Germany, though he suspected he knew the answer. Religious freedom, the farmer replied, and the opportunity to own land without feudal obligations. The Palatinate in 1741 had been recovering from wars that had devastated the region for generations. Princes fought over territory while peasants starved. Taxes supported military adventures rather than infrastructure. Young men were conscripted for battles that served dynastic ambitions rather than common welfare. So the Zimmermanns had left along with thousands of other German families who sought better lives across an ocean. They had settled in Pennsylvania, purchased land, built farms, and created prosperity through hard work in a system that rewarded productivity rather than birth status. 3 centuries later, their descendants owned hundreds of acres, operated mechanical equipment worth more than entire German villages, and produced food in quantities that would have seemed miraculous to their ancestors who had struggled in the Palatinate. The conversation haunted Klaus more than any propaganda could have prepared him to handle. The Third Reich had promised to make Germany great again, to restore glory that had supposedly been stolen by Jewish conspiracies and democratic weakness. Yet here was evidence that Germans who had abandoned the fatherland centuries earlier had achieved everything the Reich promised, and they had done it through the very democratic capitalism that Nazi ideology condemned. On the 6th day something happened that completed Klaus's psychological demolition. They were loading corn onto trucks when a car pulled up to Zimmermann's barn, and an elderly woman emerged with the assistance of a younger man who was clearly her son or grandson. She spoke German with an accent that reminded Klaus of his grandmother, the same regional inflection from Württemberg that he had heard in childhood. Zimmermann greeted her warmly, introducing her as Frau Schneider, a neighbor whose husband had passed away the previous year. She had come to discuss leasing some of her farmland to Zimmermann, as she could no longer maintain the full operation alone. The business conversation proceeded with casual efficiency, two neighbors discussing agricultural arrangements without lawyers or formal contracts, relying on trust built over decades of community interaction. But what destroyed Klaus was the subsequent conversation when Frau Schneider noticed the German prisoners working nearby. She approached them with curiosity rather than hostility, asking in German where they were from, what units they had served in, whether they had news of Württemberg where her family had originated 3 generations earlier. Klaus found himself explaining that he was from Stuttgart, that he had been a teacher before conscription, that the city had been heavily bombed and was likely unrecognizable from whatever her ancestors had described. Frau Schneider listened with the sadness of someone mourning a homeland she had never seen but felt connected to through family stories. She mentioned that her grandfather had left Württemberg in 1847, fleeing political repression and economic hardship that had made life unbearable for common people. He had settled in Lancaster County, purchased 80 acres with money earned through 7 years of labor, and built a farm that now comprised 600 acres worked by his descendants. The family had prospered across 3 generations, each one building on the previous generation's foundation, creating wealth through peaceful accumulation rather than conquest. Then Frau Schneider said something that broke Klaus completely. She mentioned that she had cousins who had remained in Württemberg, families who had chosen not to emigrate despite the hardships. She had corresponded with them through the 1920s and 1930s, watching with growing horror as they embraced nationalism that promised greatness through military revival. The letters had stopped in 1941, and she did not know if those cousins had survived the war that their ideology had made inevitable. The parallel was perfect and devastating. 2 branches of the same family, separated by an ocean and a choice made a century earlier. One branch had immigrated to America, embraced democratic capitalism, and built multi-generational prosperity through farming in Pennsylvania. The other had remained in Germany, participated in nationalism that promised glory, and experienced catastrophe that had destroyed everything they possessed. Klaus stood in Pennsylvania sunlight, surrounded by abundance created by Germans who had left the fatherland, listening to an elderly woman mourn cousins who had chosen differently. The Third Reich had promised to make Germany great, but greatness had been waiting across an ocean for anyone willing to abandon the nationalism that repeatedly destroyed European civilization. That evening, Klaus sat with Friedrich and tried to explain what was happening to both of them. The boy was struggling even more than the older prisoners, his entire worldview constructed by Nazi education that had taught him Germany was superior to mongrel America. Yet here in Lancaster County, populated largely by German immigrants and their descendants, they witnessed prosperity that exceeded anything either of them had experienced in the fatherland. Friedrich asked the question that was tormenting all of them. If Germans could build this kind of prosperity in America, why had Germany itself never achieved it? Klaus had no good answer. He mentioned factors like freedom, abundant land, democratic institutions, and market economies, but these explanations felt insufficient. The truth was more fundamental and more terrible. Germany had repeatedly chosen nationalism over freedom, military glory over prosperity, racial purity over opportunity. German Americans had achieved greatness precisely because they had abandoned these choices, because they had left behind the cultural patterns that repeatedly led Germany into catastrophic wars. The Third Reich had been the culmination of this pattern, the final proof that German nationalism was poison that destroyed everything it touched. The days continued with the same routine. Work at Zimmermann's farm, meals that exceeded anything they had known, evenings in barracks where they processed implications too massive to fully comprehend. Other work groups reported similar experiences. Those sent to different farms encountered the same abundance, the same mechanical efficiency, the same casual prosperity that made German wartime scarcity appear almost medieval by comparison. Hans Müller, who had been sent to a dairy farm, reported that his farmer produced more milk weekly than entire German villages consumed monthly. The operation used mechanical milking equipment, refrigerated storage, and automated bottling that eliminated most manual labor. The farmer employed 2 workers and produced enough dairy products to supply contracts with military bases, civilian markets, and still had surplus for export. Ernst Vogel, assigned to a vegetable farm, described greenhouses heated with oil furnaces that maintained growing conditions year-round. The farmer cultivated tomatoes, lettuce, and cucumbers during winter months when German civilians were eating turnips and potatoes. The casual deployment of fuel for agricultural luxury while simultaneously fighting global war demonstrated economic capacity that made mockery of Nazi claims about American weakness. Each prisoner's experience confirmed the same devastating pattern. America possessed such overwhelming productive capacity that it could afford abundance for civilians while maintaining military forces that overwhelmed Axis resistance. German-American communities demonstrated that German people could thrive when freed from the nationalism that had repeatedly destroyed the fatherland. The evidence was irrefutable, witnessed daily through work assignments that should have been brutal punishment but instead revealed the true depth of German self-deception. On the 10th day, Zimmermann took Klaus and Friedrich to see his extended family's farms during a break from harvest operations. They drove through countryside that looked like Bavaria transplanted to Pennsylvania, past farms owned by Schmidts, Hoffmans, Webers and Kaufmans. Each property displayed the same prosperity, the same mechanical efficiency, the same multi-generational accumulation of wealth through peaceful farming. Zimmermann explained that Lancaster County had been settled primarily by German immigrants fleeing religious persecution and economic hardship. They had purchased land from William Penn, established communities that preserved German language and culture, and built prosperity across 3 centuries. Their success had nothing to do with racial superiority or military conquest. It came from hard work and a system that rewarded productivity, protected property rights, and allowed people to keep the fruits of their labor. The tour culminated at a church cemetery where gravestones bore German names and inscriptions dating back to the 1740s. Zimmermann, Schmidt, Hoffmann, Weber. Generations of Germans who had left the fatherland and prospered in America. Their descendants now owned thousands of acres, operated mechanized farms, and produced abundance that exceeded anything their ancestors could have imagined. Klaus stood among the gravestones and felt something break inside him completely. These Germans had escaped the cycle of war and poverty that plagued European civilization. They had built something better across an ocean, creating prosperity through freedom rather than conquest. The Third Reich had promised to make Germany great again, but greatness had been achieved by those who left Germany behind. Friedrich was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide his tears. The boy had believed everything the regime taught him, had embraced Nazi ideology with the totality that only youth allows. Witnessing 300 years of German-American success was destroying foundations that had been laid over 12 years of careful indoctrination. Klaus put his hand on Friedrich's shoulder, offering the only comfort he could manage while processing his own psychological demolition. They had both fought for lies. The evidence was irrefutable. German culture could thrive without fascism. German work ethic could produce abundance without conquest. German people could achieve everything the Reich promised through the very democracy that Nazi propaganda condemned as weakness. That night, Klaus wrote a letter to his wife in Stuttgart, though he had no idea if she was alive or if the letter would reach her. He tried to explain what he had witnessed in Lancaster County, the farms owned by Germans, the prosperity built across generations, the peace that came from abandoning nationalism. But the words felt inadequate to convey the magnitude of his realization. He described the Zimmermann farm, the mechanical corn pickers, the abundance that made German wartime scarcity appear almost unreal in retrospect. He mentioned Frau Schneider and her cousins who had remained in Württemberg, the parallel trajectories that had led to such different outcomes. He tried to explain that everything the Reich had promised could have been achieved through democracy and capitalism, that German greatness did not require military conquest or racial purity. But most importantly, Klaus tried to convey the devastating knowledge that they had fought for delusion. The Third Reich had promised to restore German glory through force, not realizing that Germans who had abandoned the fatherland centuries earlier had already achieved glory through freedom. Lancaster County was proof that everything Nazi ideology claimed was necessary was actually poison that destroyed what it promised to protect. The letter would never be answered. Stuttgart had been heavily bombed, and Klaus would later learn that his wife had died in the firebombing of February 1945. But writing the letter helped him process implications too massive to hold in silent contemplation. He had witnessed paradise in the form of Pennsylvania farms owned by Germans who had made better choices than their cousins who remained in the fatherland. The work continued for weeks that stretched into months. Klaus and his fellow prisoners harvested corn, then helped with autumn vegetable crops, then assisted with farm maintenance as winter approached. Each day reinforced the same truths. America possessed overwhelming productive capacity. German-American communities demonstrated that German culture thrived under democratic capitalism. The Third Reich had been built on lies that promised everything and delivered catastrophe. As 1945 became 1946 and prisoners began receiving news of Nuremberg trials, Klaus understood that history would judge the Reich harshly. But history's judgment would be less devastating than what he had witnessed in Lancaster County. The trials would prove Nazi leaders were criminals. Lancaster proved they were fools who had rejected the very paths to greatness that German immigrants had discovered 3 centuries earlier. The psychological impact would last forever. Klaus and Friedrich and all the others who had worked on Pennsylvania farms would carry this knowledge for the rest of their lives. They had tasted abundance created by Germans who chose freedom over nationalism. They had witnessed prosperity built across generations of peace. They had seen the future that Germany had rejected when it embraced the Reich. When Klaus eventually returned to Germany in late 1946, he found Stuttgart in ruins. The city he remembered had been destroyed by bombing that left vast sections uninhabitable. His wife was dead, his school demolished, his former life erased by war that the Reich had started and lost. He would rebuild eventually, remarrying and teaching again, but he would never forget the Pennsylvania farms owned by Zimmermans and Schneiders and Hoffmans. He would never forget that Germans could prosper when freed from nationalism. He would never forget the mechanical corn pickers and abundant harvests in civilian stores displaying goods that had been luxury in wartime Germany. He would never forget Frau Schneider mourning cousins who had remained in Württemberg and embraced ideology that destroyed them. Most of all, Klaus would never forget the devastating knowledge that everything the Third Reich promised had already been achieved by Germans who left the fatherland centuries earlier. They had found greatness across an ocean, built prosperity through freedom, and created communities that preserved German culture without the nationalism that repeatedly led Germany into catastrophic wars. The donuts were gone, but the knowledge remained forever. Klaus had consumed abundance created by German Americans. In doing so, had learned that his people could build paradise when they abandoned the very nationalism that promised to create it through force. The lesson was devastating, permanent, and utterly irrefutable. Lancaster County stood as proof that Germany had chosen wrongly. The mechanical farms, the abundant harvests, the prosperous communities all testified that German greatness did not require conquest or racial purity or thousand-year Reichs. It required only freedom, opportunity, and the wisdom to choose democracy over nationalism. Klaus had fought for delusion while his enemies demonstrated truth. The war was over, but the psychological impact would last until death. He had witnessed what Germany could have become if it had chosen differently 3 centuries earlier. The vision would haunt him forever, a paradise lost not to conquest but to the terrible knowledge that paradise had been waiting for those wise enough to leave nationalism behind. Winter arrived with snow blanketing Lancaster County. Klaus watched children sledding down hills their ancestors had farmed for 2 centuries. American children with German surnames, living lives their European cousins could never imagine. Work shifted to indoor tasks. Zimmerman needed help repairing equipment, preparing for spring planting. Klaus found himself in heated workshops, fuel used casually for comfort rather than survival. One afternoon, Zimmerman showed Klaus his family Bible, births recorded back to 1742, marriages, deaths, land purchases documented in German script that gradually mixed with English. The record showed steady prosperity, each generation building on foundations laid by parents. Klaus traced entries spanning 2 centuries. No wars interrupting progression. No conscription stealing sons. No inflation destroying savings, just steady growth in a society that protected what people built. Friedrich worked beside Klaus, rarely speaking now. His worldview had been constructed by Nazi education, and Lancaster County had demolished every foundation. They attended Christmas services at Zimmerman's church, sitting in pews where German hymns had been sung for 200 years. The pastor preached in English, but German phrases emerged naturally, preserved through generations that maintained cultural identity without nationalism. The meal after services demonstrated abundance that made Klaus ill. Turkey, potatoes, vegetables, pies, all served to prisoners who had tried to destroy the democracy that now fed them. Frau Schneider approached Klaus, asking if he had family in Württemberg. He explained about his wife who had likely died in bombing, his school that no longer existed. She listened with compassion, then mentioned her church was collecting funds to rebuild German cities. The kindness broke something in Klaus. These German Americans were raising money to rebuild cities in a country that had tried to conquer the world. January brought news of Nuremberg trials. Prisoners gathered around Zimmerman's radio, listening to testimony describing atrocities Klaus had suspected but never confirmed. The systematic murder, industrial killing, bureaucratic efficiency applied to genocide. The other prisoners listened in silence. Hans Müller began vomiting. Ernst Vogel walked outside into winter cold. Friedrich sat motionless, tears streaming as he heard what his beloved Reich had accomplished. Zimmermann turned off the radio, the testimony too devastating. He looked at his prisoners with recognition that they had served something monstrous. Klaus wanted to defend himself, explain he had not known the full truth, but the words died because they were lies. He had known enough, everyone had known enough. The psychological weight became unbearable. Klaus had witnessed Lancaster County's abundance, understood German culture could thrive under democracy, learned everything the Reich promised had been lies. Now he confronted that those lies had enabled genocide. February brought thaw and spring planting preparation. Klaus and Friedrich helped Zimmermann repair fences, service equipment. The work was therapeutic, honest labor that produced visible results. One afternoon Zimmermann mentioned Klaus could stay after the war if he wanted. Lancaster County had absorbed German immigrants for 3 centuries, and one more would make little difference. The offer stunned Klaus. Stay in America? Build a new life among Germans who had prospered through choices his ancestors rejected. What waited in Germany? Ruins, death, guilt. But staying meant accepting his people had been wrong, that German greatness had been achieved by those who left the fatherland. Friedrich struggled with similar questions. He could return to Germany and rebuild ruins, or stay in America and become the kind of German American whose prosperity had demolished his worldview. March brought planning for spring planting. Klaus learned crop rotation, soil conservation, mechanical cultivation. American agriculture was science rather than tradition, constantly improving through education. Klaus realized he could teach again in Lancaster County, not propaganda, but actual knowledge. Mathematics, science, history that taught lessons rather than reinforcing nationalism. April arrived with warmth. Planting began with mechanical precision, seed drills depositing corn in rows across fields. Klaus walked behind the planter, watching seeds disappear into Pennsylvania soil Germans had cultivated for 2 centuries. News arrived that the war in Europe had ended. Hitler was dead, Germany had surrendered, the Third Reich had collapsed. Klaus listened with emotions too complex to name. Germany could have chosen democracy after the First World War, could have learned from German Americans who had built prosperity through freedom. Every step toward catastrophe had been a choice. The prisoners gathered that evening. Some wept for Germany's destruction, others felt relief, the madness had ended. Klaus sat in silence, understanding his life had been divided into before and after Lancaster County. Zimmermann visited the next day, offering job contracts to prisoners who wanted to stay. Klaus and Friedrich both accepted, unable to return to Germany's ruins. The paperwork was processed with American efficiency: work visas, employment contracts, immigration applications. Klaus signed documents transforming him from prisoner to immigrant, enemy to neighbor, German to American. Summer brought harvest of crops they had planted. Klaus worked alongside Zimmermann's hired hands, no longer prisoner but employee earning wages. He was building prosperity rather than fighting for it. Friedrich adapted easily. Youth granted resilience. The boy learned English rapidly, attended services, planned for education that would lead to owning his own farm. Klaus wrote letters to Stuttgart officials, trying to locate survivors. Most went unanswered. The city was ruins. Those who responded described conditions that made Klaus grateful for his choice. Autumn brought second harvest and agricultural rhythms Klaus was learning to appreciate: spring planting, summer cultivation, fall harvest, winter preparation. The cycle was stable, predictable, peaceful. October marked 1 year since Klaus arrived as prisoner expecting execution. Now he was employee with work visa, living in a room Zimmermann rented, saving toward land purchase. Frau Schneider invited Klaus and Friedrich to Thanksgiving, explaining the holiday's significance. The meal demonstrated abundance. Klaus was learning to expect. After dinner, Frau Schneider showed letters from her cousins in Württemberg. They had survived but faced starvation. She was sending packages, maintaining connection to family whose choices had led to catastrophe. The parallel was unavoidable. 2 branches of the Schneider family, separated by ocean and choices. One immigrated and prospered. The other remained and participated in nationalism that destroyed everything. Christmas arrived with snow and services where Klaus sang German hymns in American church. German culture could thrive under American democracy. German people could prosper when freed from militarism. Zimmermann's son returned from occupation duty, bringing photographs showing Stuttgart's devastation. Klaus looked at images of his former city and felt grief mixed with gratitude. He had chosen not to return. The new year brought reflection on transformations. Prisoner to immigrant, soldier to farmer, believer to someone who understood he had fought for lies. Friedrich purchased his first tractor in spring, used machine representing years of saved wages. The boy was planning to lease land and begin farming independently. As Klaus watched Friedrich plan his future as American farmer, he understood this was the final demolition of Nazi ideology. A former Hitler Youth member was embracing everything the Reich had condemned. Summer brought news that Klaus's immigration application had been approved. He was now legal resident with path to citizenship. The transformation was complete. He had been conquered by abundance, defeated by generosity. He would never return to Germany. Lancaster County was home now, where he would build life on foundations of truth rather than propaganda. Decades later, Klaus would tell his grandchildren about the war he fought for lies. He would describe the shock of seeing Lancaster, the psychological demolition of working on farms owned by Germans who prospered through choices his ancestors rejected. But most importantly, Klaus would teach his grandchildren that nationalism was poison, that German culture could thrive under democracy, that prosperity came from freedom rather than conquest. The mechanical farms, abundant harvests, prosperous communities testified that German greatness did not require Reichs or racial purity or conquest. It required only wisdom to choose democracy over nationalism. Klaus had consumed abundance created by German Americans and learned that paradise was built by those who abandoned the very nationalism that promised to create it through conquest. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.